I'm Susan Yonke with VOA's Middle East Monitor. Coming up, what changes have occurred since the Arab Spring began? Analysts express concern about a military confrontation over Iran's nuclear ambitions. Former U.S. officials debate what was achieved in Iraq.
While Saddam was a nasty piece of work, Iraq was contained. He had ambitions in the region, but he had no way to carry them out.
It's all ahead on The Voice of America. This month marks 1 year since the start of the Arab Spring. VOA's David Byrd recently took a look at what changes have occurred since last January, and he's written a report about it for MiddleEastVoices.com. And he joins me now here in the studio. Say, Dave, how you doing?
I'm fine, Susan. Thank you.
Good, good. Hey, what were the major changes you highlighted in your report?
What I tried to look at in this report on MiddleEastVoices.com was four things, basically. Political changes, human rights changes, the rise of political Islam, and the West's role in fomenting or putting forth pluralistic democracy in the Arab world.
What about human rights? Has much changed in that arena?
Well, that's one area where things are still very much in flux. You have seen the rise of a more democratic government in Tunisia, but in Egypt, right next door, you've seen the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces being accused of carrying out abuses that were worse than under former President Hosni Mubarak. In Bahrain, the situation is very much in flux with demonstrations in the streets. Syria, of course, is very, very problematic because there are people getting killed there every day. So human rights is still an issue that is got to be settled and has not been settled in the past 12 months.
How about the rise of Islamic parties in places like Egypt?
Well, you know, I attended a talk by the U.S. Institute of Peace this week here in Washington, and one of the speakers was former Jordanian ambassador to the United States, Marwan Mouasher. He said that the West needs to realize that the Islamists are not, in his words, the devils or the Democrats in the Arab world, that because most of the Arab world is Muslim, we're going to see the rise of political Islam, and we're going to be dealing with people who, at least in name, are Islamic parties. But that doesn't mean, as the perception in his words is often in the West, that they are either agents of Al-Qaeda or someone like Hezbollah or Hamas. So another speaker at this talk, former National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley, said, because the Arab world is predominantly Muslim, we're going to have to learn how to deal with people who have Islamist or Islamic in their party name.
Is there anything that the United States should or could do?
I think the most profound thing that I found in this report was Marwan Mouasher's statement where he said the West needs to be candid. We need to be upfront and honest with the Arab world and say, look, we want to help you. We have some reservations about some of the policies that you're putting forth. And there's also overcoming the perception of the United States shoring up some of the former dictators, like former President Hosni Mubarak in Egypt or President Saleh in Yemen. And so that's got to be overcome. But there needs to be what Mr. Mouasher called pluralistic democratic reform.
Well, thank you, David, for stopping by.
All right. Thank you, Susan.
That's VOA reporter David Byrd here in our Washington studios. And if you'd like to read his report, just stop on by MiddleEastVoices.com.
Are you looking for a comprehensive daily look at events reshaping the Middle East? Visit voanews.com/ME. You'll find VOA's original reporting from the region, in-depth analysis from our Washington team, VIP interviews, online polls, photo essays, and mini documentaries. Bookmark us or add us to your RSS reader. That's voanews.com/ME.
Tensions between Western countries and Iran over its nuclear program continue to rise as sanctions threaten the country's economy. VOA correspondent Meredith Buell reports from Washington. The analysts are expressing concern a military confrontation could occur in the Middle East.
Iranian war games in the Persian Gulf amid threats to close the strategic Strait of Hormuz. The United States and Europe tighten sanctions to choke off Iranian oil revenues. Iran begins enriching uranium at an underground plant as one of its nuclear scientists is killed in a bomb attack. All signs, analysts say, that a military confrontation could be looming. International Institute of Strategic Studies expert Mark Fitzpatrick.
I think Iran is feeling under increasing pressure. It is feeling, probably for the first time, sanctions that do have a real bite.
Iranian analysts say a possible oil embargo is essentially a declaration of war, and for the government to survive, it will fight back. Sadek Sabakalam of Tehran University.
The only natural weapon that Iran has is to block a Strait of Hormuz.
U.S. military and diplomatic officials have warned that Iran will not be allowed to block the strait. Patrick Clausen of the Washington Institute.
And if they would do that, I don't know if they quite realize that they would be crossing an American red line and that there would be military conflict.
The United States has been pressing allies in Asia to reduce the amount of oil imported from Iran, and President Barack Obama recently approved tough sanctions targeting Iran's central bank to pressure Tehran to abandon its nuclear program. U.S. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner.
And we are exploring ways, as I said, to cut off the central bank from the international financial system and to reduce the earnings Iran derives from its oil exports.
As a result, prices are up in Iranian markets as inflation has skyrocketed. Iran's currency is rapidly losing value. The pressure is mounting, says analyst Patrick Clausen.
Iran's finding itself in a much more difficult situation than when just the Americans were applying pressure.
The International Atomic Energy Agency says there is evidence Iran is researching the development and delivery of nuclear weapons, but Tehran insists its nuclear program is for peaceful purposes. Iran has signaled it is willing to reopen negotiations with Western powers, but analysts say all the heated rhetoric could poison diplomatic efforts. Jamal Abdi of the National Iranian American Council.
I see the saber rattling as reducing the space necessary on both sides to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict.
Iran's nuclear program is expected to be the topic of a new round of talks between Tehran and Western nations in the coming months. Meanwhile, tensions intensify as sanctions continue to squeeze Iran's economy. Meredith Buell, VOA News, Washington.
After almost 9 years of conflict, U.S. combat troops are no longer in Iraq. In this report from Washington, VOA senior correspondent Andre Dineshra spoke with 3 former high-ranking government officials about what was achieved in Iraq.
The United States invaded Iraq in March 2003 to topple Saddam Hussein's government and to search for suspected weapons of mass destruction. Saddam was overthrown, but his weapons of mass destruction were never found. Former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton.
The main thing we achieved was the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and the elimination of his regime, which was a threat to international peace and security in the region and really globally. And that's true, whatever the final story is on his weapons of mass destruction, his regime was the threat.
But former National Security Advisor General Brent Scowcroft, who opposed the U.S. military intervention in Iraq, sees it from another angle.
While Saddam was a nasty piece of work, Iraq was contained. He had ambitions in the region, but he had no way to carry them out. His army was weak, as we demonstrated when we went in there, and he was not a basic threat to the region. And the price we paid to get rid of him was extremely high.
Nearly 4,500 U.S. troops were killed, more than 30,000 wounded. At the height of the conflict, more than 170,000 American soldiers and Marines were in Iraq. Tens of thousands of Iraqis lost their lives. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent on the war effort. Now, after nearly 9 years of conflict, U.S. combat troops are home. Former Defense Secretary William Cohen looks at what was accomplished during the U.S. intervention in Iraq.
Well, we achieved allowing the Iraqi people to go to the polls. The seedlings of democracy have been spread. Whether they can be sustained or not remains to be seen. They've been given an opportunity to have a democracy as opposed to an authoritarian dictatorship. Whether they will be able to keep it is a question for them to decide at this point.
Looking back on the U.S. role in Iraq, Ambassador Bolton says Washington might have overstayed its welcome.
we would have been better off turning responsibility for Iraq at a political level back into the hands of the Iraqis much more quickly. I think our situation there might be a lot better today if we had not created the Coalition Provisional Authority, if we had not done so much really to try and take responsibility onto ourselves for running Iraq for a longer period of time.
As for the future, General Brent Scowcroft puts it this way.
Next for Iraq is coming to terms with itself. And Iraq is a very complicated country. It's divided religiously, it's divided ethnically. It is a rich country, but with the riches not equally distributed, it has a lot of coming together that has to be done.
Since the U.S. withdrawal, Iraq has been facing an escalating political crisis and has been the scene of numerous bombings. U.S. officials have warned that in the days and months ahead, the political and security situation in Iraq could be volatile. Andre Dinesh, VOA News, Washington.
If you crave the latest news and analysis about the Middle East, follow us on our Twitter feed. You can find it by searching @VOA Middle East. Every day we tweet VOA's own special reports, analysis, VIP interviews, photo essays, and mini documentaries. Plus, you'll get the latest buzz from VOA's Mideast team and correspondents. VOA Middle East on Twitter. Get a read on the news before it happens. Russia is wading into the Middle East peace process this week. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held talks with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in Moscow today.
I hope we will use our meeting today to exchange points of view about the situation in the Middle East, and first of all about the necessity of resuming the negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians on the existent international legal basis.
Israeli-Palestinian peace talks have been stalled for more than 3 years over the issue. One of the roadblocks is Israeli settlement construction in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Palestinian President Abbas said he hoped progress would be made in Moscow on the issue.
Of course, it would be important for us to concentrate today's meeting on the last events happening in Palestinian territories, on the negotiations, on the issue of the Palestinian reconciliation, as well as on the global Arab situation of these past few days, which is, as we know, tense.
Chief negotiators from both Israel and the Palestinian territories began meeting earlier this month to try to find a way to resume formal negotiations. The Arab League observer mission is to remain in Syria until Sunday, when Arab foreign ministers are due to review a report on the situation by the team's Sudanese chief. They are then to decide whether to keep the team of about 165 observers in Syria for another month. Human Rights Watch today urged the Arab League to release the report publicly. In a statement, the group said it has documented daily violations by security forces against protesters. It said it also has evidence that the Syrian government has taken steps to interfere with the work of the international monitors. The observers have been trying to verify if Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's government is keeping its pledge to stop the violent suppression of the uprising against his 11-year autocratic rule. Syrian rights groups have criticized the observers' effectiveness, saying the Assad government has deceived the team and escalated deadly attacks on the opposition since the observers began work on December 26. Qatar's ruling emir has called for Arab troops to be deployed in Syria to stop the government crackdown. Syria has rejected the idea. The United Nations says violence linked to the uprising has killed more than 5,400 people. Syria says terrorists have killed about 2,000 members of the security forces since the unrest began. In Istanbul, tens of thousands of supporters of slain ethnic Armenian journalist Hrant Dink marked the 5th anniversary of his murder, with many claiming the Turkish state was involved. But a court has ruled there was no conspiracy, provoking national and international criticism. Dorian Jones reports from Istanbul.
We want justice for Hrant, shout supporters of the slain ethnic Armenian journalist Hrant Dink. Tens of thousands of people marched through the centre of Istanbul to the offices of the Turkish Armenian newspaper Argos, which Dink once edited. to mark the 5th anniversary of his murder. Along with grief, the protesters are expressing anger. On Tuesday, a court convicted a man for instigating the murder, but acquitted 19 people on state conspiracy charges. For this, Dink supporters say justice was not served.
The real subjects of the case are still has not been imprisoned. For me, it represents the state's attitude towards this kind of political murders. Like they are mostly tended to protect the killers rather than to punish them.
Dink was shot dead just outside his office by 17-year-old nationalist Orgun Sames. Sames was sentenced last year to 22 years in jail. But Dink's family and supporters claim senior members of the Turkish state were the architects of his murder. Dink had been a target for nationalists and the state for describing the mass killings of Armenians in Turkey during World War I as genocide. Shortly before his murder, he was convicted of insulting Turkey with his views. The Turkish representative of the US-based Human Rights Watch, MS Sinclair Webb, says with so much evidence implicating the state in Dink's murder, the court's decision gives a disturbing message.
If you're an Armenian journalist in Turkey, you can be murdered and your killers, who are deeply connected with the state, will somehow not be investigated for their links with the state, and the state authorities won't be held to account. That's the message that this gives, this case. More broadly, the case comes in a climate of clampdown on government oppositionists, imprisonment of particularly Kurdish journalists.
Turkey's ruling AK party is facing growing criticism in connection with the case. The party had been seen as being in the forefront of purging the state of anti-democratic forces. Political scientist Cengiz Aktar of Istanbul's Bahçeşehir University says the Dink verdict is a worrying sign for Turkey. He argues now the state is purged of anti-government forces, the ruling AK party has become the status quo.
We always had a difference in Turkey between the government and the state. The state was actually working against the AK government in the early years of its power. But now it's one and the same. It's clear that the Turkish democratic transformation is slowly but surely coming to an end. It means that the old forces and the old elite and the old habits will come back.
Turkey's Deputy Prime Minister Bülent Arınç acknowledged the criticism about the verdict and says it can be appealed. But among Dink supporters protesting the verdict, there are mixed feelings about whether justice can be secured. Dorian Jones for VOA News, Istanbul, Turkey.
Researchers have known for years that terrorists have been trying to use the internet for a variety of purposes, such as coordinating attacks or monitoring troop movements. Now comes a new study that suggests 90% of terrorists' online activity is taking place in the relative open spaces of social networks like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And that has some worried about a new wave of extremists recruiting drives on the web. Doug Bernard covers the internet and society here at VOA, and he joins us now. Hi, Doug.
It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for saying that. What can you tell us about this study?
Well, researchers and I think people have known for a long time that terrorists are active online, but it was usually presumed that they were active in what we would call sort of the small darkened quarters, bulletin boards, places that you had to actually work hard to find so they could keep their identities pretty secluded. Well, now comes this study put out by Gabriel Wyman, who is a communications professor at Haifa University. It is a study looking at how terrorists use the internet for coordination of their movement, for monitoring other troops, but particularly how they're using it for propaganda and recruiting drives. And in fact, it's this, the idea of using the web as a tool for recruitment, that has Dr. Wyman particularly concerned, in part because he says terrorists are reaching new populations that are unaware of the source of the information they're receiving.
That is, if you are, let's say, a student, if you're learning in a high school, or if you're a journalist preparing an article on a subject related to a terrorist group, and you use Google search in a very naive way, you may very likely hit on a website which was posted there by terrorists without even knowing that. And the spread of propaganda and the spread of this online recruitment are done in a very, I would say, a smart way, in a very concealed way, in a very persuasive way, so that sometimes very naive populations may be seduced and tempted.
What does it mean exactly when he says 90% of terrorist activity is on social networks?
Well, it's a really good question. In fact, when I asked him specifically, he said, well, the numbers do move around. We are talking about the internet, after all. That is a figure that another researcher, Evan Coleman, has also used. But it really comes down to how exactly do you find social media or social networks? I mean, obvious Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, those are obvious ones. But increasingly, even websites like our own, VOA and other places, allow for so much interaction between users that they in part become a social network. So I think a lot of researchers are raising questions as to, well, what does it mean to say terrorists are spending 90% of their time on social networks? Does that mean that a terrorist is going to try and friend my child? Well, probably not.
Well, what's being done about this?
Well, a lot, actually. International intelligence agencies are obviously watching social networks. They've been very clear about that, just to sort of see what's going on. And I think in a general sense, too, there's been an effort among other people, those who are inclined not to terror but to building peace, building trust, to counter those messages. So if somebody goes on Facebook and puts a message of support for jihad or an attack, increasingly likely that will be countered by an equal number, if not greater number, of messages in opposition to that. Another researcher that we spoke with very quickly, terror analyst William McCants, said, look, it's just really not a well-founded fear that young people are being recruited online.
We have not seen many examples, if any, of someone who has gone from complete ignorance to total supporter of Al-Qaeda just by being exposed to online material. It's usually the case that they're already in a network with some people who are supporters, and more often the case that they have real-world ties to people who are supporters of Al-Qaeda.
So how concerned are you that someone you interact with online is a terrorist?
Me, not very. And I have to say, we interact with a lot of people online here at Voice of America. But look, I'm always cautious and careful, especially if it's somebody I don't know. I'm even cautious about the people who I think I know who they are, but of course you never can be too sure on the internet. So look, the old rules still apply. You be careful what you say, watch what you say, with whom you share it, and always question, the source of where information is coming from. But I think, the kind of hysterical reaction to this one study seems, from other researchers, to be a little unfounded. I think we can all take a deep breath and not worry so much.
Well, thank you. That's nice to know.
It is.
Okay, Doug, thanks for stopping by the studio.
Thank you for asking.
That's VOA social media reporter Doug Bernard here in our Washington studios. Iranian media say police have closed dozens of toy stores for selling American-made Barbie dolls. The popular dolls were banned as part of a crackdown on Western culture in Iran, but have been sold illegally. The semi-official Mir news service said today that a dozen stores have been closed in a stepped-up effort to reduce the impact of permissive Western culture on Iran. This show wraps up another week of VOA's Middle East Monitor. Our reporters Cecily Hillary, Mohammed El-Shinawi, David Arnold, and David Byrd. Our social media team, Yuri Hiltaichuk, Momo Hutton, and Jessica Stahl. Our director, Patrice Martin. Our managing editor, David Hutchins. Senior editor, Bob Morris. And all of our technicians and engineers around the world. Thanks for tuning in to Middle East Monitor.
For more on the stories you've heard on our radio programs, visit our website at voanews.com. That's where you'll find in-depth reports, related stories, videos, and more from our team of correspondents. Or take the news with you by downloading podcasts of your favorite VOA program. That's at voanews.com.
voanews.com.
Online news for a changing world.